Welcome to the PeakDay podcast, where we discuss fertility and natural family planning with our friends. Today's guest is John Bishop, founder and executive director of Forge. John started his professional career working at the Fellowship of Catholic University students. While working for Focus, he earned his doctorate from the Catholic University of America, writing his dissertation on the nature of masculine virtue. Inspired by the thought of John Paul II, John's now fighting for men and for the family as founder and executive director of Forge. The goal at Forge is to fight the decades-long corrosion of the family by cultivating exceptional husbands, fathers, and marriages, providing crucial resources for all aspects of family life. John lives in Des Moines, Iowa, with his wife, Caitlin, and their 3 children. Thank you, John, for joining us on the PeakDay podcast.
Martha, it's absolutely fantastic to be here. I got to say, too, this is maybe the best name for a podcast that I've ever heard. I love it. PeakDay podcast.
That's great. Yeah, we named it after the app. So we have an app called the PeakDay.
Yeah.
Where women can, record their cycles. So, yep.
No, my wife and I love practicing natural family planning. So she got a chuckle out of it too. So,
yeah. So tell us a little bit about your family.
Yeah. So I've been married. I'm a baby in marriage in comparison to many of the people who I'm sure are listening to this podcast, but I've been married for just a little less than 5 years. My wife and I got married in Nashville, Tennessee, which is actually where I'm recording from. I live in Des Moines, Iowa, like you said, but my wife is from the South, from down here in Nashville. We have 3 kids. So our oldest is about 3 3/4, will be 4 in September. Then we have a son who just turned 2, and another son who was born on December 10th. So about 6 months old. Oh. And so got a gang. Excited to, God willing, someday have more. But love the children that we have.
Wonderful. So in the introduction, we talked a little bit about your role at Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University students. How instrumental was your role at Focus in laying the foundation for Forge?
Yeah, so Focus played an enormous role in my life, period. Both my, I guess what you might call my personal life and my professional life. There's a lot of bleed back and forth between the two. My wife and I were both deeply impacted by the organization. So Caitlin, my wife, had a profound conversion, reversion, you might say, to the faith while she was in college. The same thing happened for me. I joined Focus, when was that? 2015, and continued to work for Focus all the way through December 31st of 2023. So I worked for Focus for a long time. It was conversations with a Focus missionary, going to a Focus conference that played a big role in my own coming back to the faith. The same thing for my spouse. Now, I did a lot of things in Focus. So I started out just doing the Focus missionary thing, but as I progressed in the organization, I ended up working at Focus's international headquarters, which are in Denver, Colorado, Golden, actually, just west of the city. There, I oversaw a series of summer programs. They're called Focus Summer Projects. I played a big role in Focus's new staff training. I oversaw Focus's retreat program, played a role in the big Focus conferences. But one thing that I loved to do when I was at the headquarters was to teach and to write curriculum for Focus. One of the things that I wrote for Focus is Focus's resource on theology of the body. So I'm in love with John Paul II and his teachings on marriage and family. Theology of the body was actually played a big role in my doctoral dissertation as well. So the things that I did over that 8.5 years that I was working for Focus had a profound impact on me. I'm still in love with the organization. They do so much good on campuses all across the country and abroad.
Right. I have actually 2 nieces who work in Colorado for.
Oh, really?
Focus. Yeah.
Yeah.
One
Okay.
was a missionary,
Yeah.
And we were just at Seek as an organization for couple league, and that was just wow, wow.
Yeah. It's a big conference. Yeah. Does a lot of good. I had a really impactful confession at a Seek conference in about 2011 that was a kind of the turning point for me. So
Beautiful.
those those conferences do a lot of good. For any of our listeners who haven't been before, I enthusiastically encourage you, no matter what age you are, to go to a conference.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It is. It was so encouraging for us, being at the booth, seeing all of these young, on fire Catholic students, and
yeah,
and the graduates of Focus and their families coming along,
right.
with the kids. It was really great to see that happening.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Focus was impactful on my thinking in a lot of different ways. So at Forge, one way that I articulate our mission is I say that we're taking the tools of evangelization to the privileged playing field of evangelization. So I take the family, sexuality, marriage to be the battlefield of our times. And insofar as they're the battlefield, they're also probably the place where grace is being poured out more than anywhere else. And so where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And what I wanted to do was take things like discipleship, small groups, a lot of the resource types that are being developed by Focus that I participated in developing in Focus, and then bring them to the space of the family, particularly to the space of husbands and fathers. And so we're fighting for the family with an emphasis on husbands and fathers at Forge. And many of the things that we're doing, small groups, mentorship, things of that nature, are largely in line with the way that they're done by the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, by Focus. So to more directly answer your question, I kind of view what I'm doing now to be very related to what I did for so many years at Focus.
Right, right. So was there like a one inspiration point that Forge was kind of born, or was it kind of
Yeah.
developed over a long time?
Yeah. It does have a story that there was definitely a moment. Okay. So I remember my wife and I had gone on a date. This was about 15 months ago now. And we were still living in Denver, Colorado at the time. We came back from the date, and my wife just asks me, John, if you could do anything in the world, what would you do? And at the time, I just responded to her, just saying, I kind of love what I do. I'll probably just keep working for Focus for the rest of my life. But she kind of pressed me a little bit, and she said, no, like really, if you could do anything at all, what would you do? And I said, well, I love working on college campuses, but I think if I could work in any space at all, if I could do evangelization in any space at all, I would do it in the context of the family, largely for the reasons that I already said, that college campuses are wonderful places. They're critically important. But I felt so drawn to what I'll call the fight for the family. You mentioned in my bio that while I was working for Focus, I was really blessed. I got a fellowship to go to the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., while I was working for Focus and get a doctorate in theology. During that time, I went through a lot of interests as a graduate student in what I would study, but I eventually sort of settled on the ethical tradition of the church, particularly sex ethics. And then I wrote a doctoral dissertation, you said in the intro, on masculine virtue, to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. The dissertation had a few different parts. The first of those parts was a deep dive into what I call the crisis of men, the crisis of masculinity in the church and in the culture. It goes from there into kind of like the fundamental psychological differences that delineate men and women. Okay, so actually coming at it from the perspective of evolutionary biology, what is it, that motivated, so to speak, our evolutionary predecessors to split and for there to be males and females. Okay, and then the last portion of the dissertation says, well, if this is sort of psychological male and female raw material, what does it look like to perfect, especially that male raw material? Okay. And so I'd been writing on that the whole time, thinking that I would simply continue on and put those thoughts to use in some way, shape, or form in Focus, which I did to some degree. But I want to pause for a moment, kind of zoom back to the conversation with my wife, where I'd been thinking for a long time about the family. I mean, I'd been thinking for a long time, especially about husbands and fathers. And as I was writing, thinking, and working on that doctoral dissertation, going through my graduate studies, I also had a foot firmly planted in ministry, where I was leading Bible studies at the University of Maryland and living with Focus missionaries and going to conferences. And what I found time after organization after organization, as I worked and as I thought, was that so many organizations and institutions in the church, particularly those that are connected with family, they're dominated by women. That there's in many of them, whether it's a Theology on Tap or a Focus conference, or just Mass on Sunday. I mean, Pew Research says that in your average Sunday Mass congregation in the Catholic Church in the United States, it's 61% female and 39% male. So the church's organizations, the apostolates, particularly apostolates like Focus and others, are sort of like, to say it in a kind of funny way to get a point across, oftentimes women's organizations with a few male officers. Now, that's tough, especially when you consider that it's particularly the involved presence of a husband and of a father that positively correlates with so many positive metrics, from educational success to job success, to simply, kind of raw human flourishing. That it's the presence of men that are oftentimes the key piece in making families flourish. But our church, particularly the church's organizations that have anything to do with the family, they're dominated by women. So I was talking to Caitlin and I said, if I could fight in any space, I think I wouldn't fight so much for the college on the college campus, though that's critically important. Right. I think I'll fight for the family. But if I'm going to fight for the family, we must do so in a way that emphasizes men. Because if we're not careful to create a distinctively masculine culture, a culture that's inviting to men in this organization, then we're probably not setting ourselves up for success. So Forge is in the fight for the family, and eventually, we will develop some resources, especially for women. But what we're doing, particularly in our first few years, is working exclusively with men, so as to very carefully create a distinctively masculine culture. So, does that make sense, Martha?
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads into my next question, and you've alluded to it a little bit. But what has happened in society and in the church that requires a ministry like Forge to encourage men to step forward and make a difference for families and society?
Yeah. So I want to answer that question very simply to get the main point across, and I'll give a little detail and go from there. So what has happened to men? Well, the sexual revolution has happened to men. The effeminization of the culture has happened to men. But as a part of that sexual revolution, I don't know of anything that is more negatively impacting men than contraception. And I want to say why. All right. So a lot of people just kind of take this to be a women's issue. I want to tell you a story that comes from my experience writing my dissertation, particularly that first bit of the doctoral dissertation on the crisis of men and masculinity. I was reading a man with a rather unfortunate name. So his name is Dr. Lionel Tiger, and he's an evolutionary sociologist, famed sociologist out of Rutgers University. No religious background whatsoever. And so I was reading this man. He wrote a book called The Decline of Males, okay, that chronicles kind of statistic by statistic how men are falling behind in education, falling behind in overall job performance, skyrocketing rates of male incarceration, prison time. Okay, so in every relevant stat, falling behind in rates of fatherhood. In the 1960s, the rate of American fatherlessness for children was 9%. It's now 25%. That means that 22.5 million kids in the United States right now are growing up without a resident father. Okay. And that has enormous negative impact across society. So I was reading this sociologist, Lionel Tiger, Decline of Males. And this guy, who's not a Catholic or anything like that, there's a key point in the book where he says, look, if there's any single kind of turn in human history that wrecked male flourishing, well, it's contraception. And, why does he say that? So he's kind of got an interesting take that maybe your listeners haven't heard before. So he actually says that kind of using language that the nerds listening to the podcast will recognize from Karl Marx, that what Marx says capitalism does. Now, I am not a believer in Karl Marx, so just for the record, I'm rehearsing an argument here. What Karl Marx says is that for an economy, what capitalism does to the working class members of that economy is it takes away the means of production. And for that reason, the working class, they don't care anymore. They have no ownership in the production process. They don't have a stake, if you will. They're kind of like, workers in McDonald's who they don't own anything. They just get an hourly wage. Of course, they don't care quite as much about the work that they do because of the manner in which they're allowed to participate in the production process, right? They don't take pride in the hamburger patties, in the same way that somebody who owns their own restaurant takes pride, in the way that they make a meal. Okay. Now, transfer that same line of thinking from production to reproduction. And this, again, completely non-religious sociologist says, well, that's what's happening to men when it comes to sex and when it comes to the family. Men, by virtue of their biology, are already at a sort of weak spot, if you will, when it comes to naturally caring about their children. That is, women, they carry their children for 9 months. Then if the mother's nursing, then they're nursing the baby. Women are naturally more attuned right away to care about their babies. Mm-hmm. Now, men who are already at a disadvantage when it comes to that, if they have that already weak connection to their child, right, to their product, to use a crass term, if you will, weakened anymore, just in a natural sense, what you're doing is you're developing a form of sexuality that manipulates men into caring even less about being a father. And in a way that kind of pollutes the whole sexual ecosystem of our culture, that of course opens wide the doors to any other manner of sort of mistaken sexuality, right? So I oftentimes say that contraception is the first instance of fake sex that opened the door to many, many other instances of fake sex. Okay, so we began with condoms, we began with the birth control pill, right? And we severed sexuality from its natural end, if you will. Okay. Then of course we go a step further and you have things like no-fault divorce. You have a promiscuous culture. Eventually you have things like the ultimate fake sex. You might think of pixels on a computer screen, virtual sex, pornography. The first instance of fake sex that of course takes prominence in the 1950s and 1960s with the birth control pill flowers into the contemporary culture that you see today. So I don't think that there's anything that hurts men more than fake sex, that manipulates them more, that keeps them from becoming good fathers. And the first instance of that sex, fake sex, is contraception.
Right.
So anyway, I went on for a while there, Martha, but that's how I got interested in why kind of my take on the crisis of men and masculinity. I think it's particularly the sexual manipulation of men by the culture that keeps them from the place where, at least in a natural context, they flourish the most, and that's when they become fathers. It's not to say that men can't become single and flourish to a very, very high degree, but that in the natural course of events, that's where many men do flourish. Right. And I decided to lean into that space to say that if we're going to rehabilitate the family, then we've got to rehabilitate men. And we might need to begin with defending them against the sexual manipulation that has led to their downfall.
Mm-hmm. So, in specifics, how does Forge help men build build up themselves and build a family that thrives?
Yeah. So we get really simple. Okay. So fundamentally, Forge fights the battle for the family on two fronts. Okay. So I say that we develop professional world class resources. Okay. So we make content. That's one front. And then the other front is we fight the battle on the ground. Um, I want to talk about the content side in particular because I think it matters most for this podcast. But just to touch on the ground side for a moment, we do small groups, we do mentorship, we do retreats. We have our first conference coming up on March 8th, 2024. Now, that stuff it largely resembles the work that Focus does. It's just transported to the context of the family. Okay, and so. Men, fathers, if you're listening to this podcast, get involved with a small group. I think they really matter. All right. Now, that said, what I want to talk to you about particularly today is content. So Forge, when we launched 6 months ago, launched with a course. Okay. We have 2 more courses coming out in August that I'll talk to you about at the end of the podcast. But this first course that we developed sort of went for the jugular. Given everything that I've said thus far, we thought, gosh, we want to develop a course that concretely helps people in a way that they're not being helped, at least as far as we can tell, on the market today. So we want to develop a resource that doesn't exist. We want to do it in a professional way that will really help people very simply. So we decided to develop a course. We just call it Fathers and Sons, that's on the healthy sexual formation of young men. So fundamentally, what does the course do? Well, the course answers the question, how do you raise a sexually healthy son in a sexually toxic culture? So if you're a dad and you have a son who's 2 or who's 5 or who's 10 or who's 15 or who's 19, and you're wondering, how do I raise this man to be an incredible husband and an incredible father for the next generation? Well, this course answers that question. We do it in 6 modules. So the way that the course is laid out, we have 6 installments of content, call them modules. And in each module, there's a 25-minute video and about a 15-page written resource. A lot of people will just watch the videos, but really encourage you to read the written resources as well. The videos, we were really blessed. We had a group of benefactors that actually gave us a grant of $100,000 to put into the video production. So they look sharp, they're professional. We consulted with upwards of 20 psychologists from around the country in putting the materials together. The primary author of the course was a man formerly of the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Pat Fagan, who's spent a large part of his career thinking about topics related to this subject and has raised 8 kids, 4 sons himself. And the course basically empowers fathers as primary educators of their children to do sexual formation themselves. So at Forge, we're really convicted that sexual formation, I mean, even if your kids go to an incredible school, it's never something that you should just delegate as a parent. You know, after all, it's, I mean, presumably, unless your children are adopted, it's your sex that brought your kids into being. So it kind of stands to reason, I think, right? That you should be the one to form them when it comes to the sexual dimension of their being. So again, to sum up, the course basically tackles the question in a thorough but incredibly practical manner. How does a father raise a sexually healthy son in the midst of a sexually toxic culture?
Yep, absolutely. You recently wrote an article about male initiation rights and
Yeah,
how young
I've written a
boys.
lot on that. Yeah,
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 yeah. So your idea was in order for them to become good men, they need to have an idea of the man that they want to become.
that's right.
So can you expand on that a little bit?
I'd love to. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So thanks for bringing it up. So, across time and place, in almost every society, except for contemporary United States culture, a few other Western cultures, societies had, whether they were explicitly detailed or just implicit in the culture, they had sort of cultural tracks, if you will, that took boys along the route from being a boy to being a man. And to be a man, that is to be recognized by the culture as not just an adult human, but an adult male human, that is a man, is something that boys desperately want. I often say that boys will be boys. There's a recklessness, a wildness about boys. There's something to that. But that saying kind of overlooks an even deeper desire in the psychology of a young male. That is, boys want to be men. And for many boys, and in a certain sense, indeed, for all boys begin in what is an essentially feminine environment, right? I mean, all of them literally begin in the womb. I can't think of a more feminine environment than the womb, right? And then they go from there, really, especially as young boys, they're around their moms a lot more than when, being around their dads. Even in this day and age, that's just kind of how it works, right? There then comes a point in the maturation process of any young boy where he kind of wants to depart from that essentially feminine environment that he grew up in and be recognized as kind of having changed, right? I'm no longer, in that space. I'm no longer a boy. I'm a man. And I want to be recognized as a man. I want to be part of the man club. Mm-hmm. Note that trajectory, that journey that boys go through is, at least in a certain sense, very different from the trajectory that a lot of women go through. Of course, for women, there needs to be a maturation process as well. There's a deep need for young women to be formed, by groups of women, by their mothers, most fundamentally. All of that's critical, but there's a sort of steadiness to the female trajectory that is not parallel in the male trajectory, the male maturation process. Now, in our present culture, which has, at least in some domains, villainized masculinity, what our culture has done is it's taken the examples of good men that boys really need psychologically and said those examples are bad, right? So you have things like, unfortunately, our churches, certainly the majority of our educational institutions aren't extolling good men. They're only critiquing bad men. Now, that's really problematic if you're a young boy, because when you hit that critical juncture that I described, and you want to be recognized as a man, what you're doing is you're looking around in your culture for examples of good, wholesome, healthy, positive masculinity. And nowadays, you can't get those examples oftentimes from your church. You don't get those examples from your school. And the only place where you can get them is places like YouTube or, God forbid, the streets. So what I often say about this whole dynamic is that the movement that has villainized masculinity, call it the toxic masculinity movement, that movement is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, it puts boys in that really difficult position of having no positive masculine role models. So then only cultivates in them a version of masculinity that they can find from people like Andrew Tate on YouTube, or that they can find, God forbid, in a gang from the streets. In fact, what we should be doing if we want to form good, healthy young boys is to give them true versions of masculinity. Show them, yes, masculinity is different from femininity, and it's good. It's deeply good. That wildness that you have inside you, the propensity to risk. I oftentimes say, gosh, like if you need any, if you're short on evidence that males and females are different, go ahead, follow the money. Compare and contrast the insurance rates of your average 16-year-old male and your average 16-year-old female. Boys are wild. They just are. It's hardwired in their DNA. Mm-hmm. And their development, that is, their coming to maturity, looks different than young women. And we have a responsibility to give them the examples that they need. That's one of the things that the course talks about. Mm-hmm. It says it's critical, for example, for especially boys in early adolescence, not just to be formed by their fathers, although that is critical, that they're deeply formed specifically by their fathers, but also that they're formed by a group of men. I oftentimes say that the best of men were raised not just by a good father, but by a good father and his friends. Like I remember being a young boy and thinking, gosh, there's certain things that I'm not going to receive from my dad, but I'll take them, from Bob, or from Cliff, another one of my dad's friends, because yeah, those guys, they got it going on. And I connect with them, at least in some ways, even a little bit more than I do my dad. And I think what happened to me, and what happens in boys who are raised in that kind of healthy environment, is they're undergoing a kind of modern day initiation rite. That is, they're received into a group of men who are almost collectively raising that boy. The father plays the key role. He's the primary educator, but the group together is raising that boy into being a man. And it's things like that, the importance of things like that, the practicals of things like that the Course talks about. Mm-hmm. So yeah, does that make sense? I'd love to talk about other pieces of the Course, but do you see that piece there, Martha?
Absolutely. Let's talk about marriage.
Yeah.
So like when a couple, they prepare for marriage, their intention is to be married for life, be faithful to each other, open to children. Do you address that in your course, like natural family planning and the virtue of chastity?
Yes, we certainly do. Yeah. One of the things that we say in the Course that's so critical, this point is true both for young boys and for young girls, is that your sexual formation as a member of a family really kind of falls right out of the nature of the sexual relationship between your mom and your dad. So there's a point in the Course where we say to all of the men taking the Course, gosh, if you want to raise a sexually healthy son, perhaps the best thing that you can do is to have a vibrant, wholesome, chaste, sexually healthy relationship with your wife. And if you do that first, if you show her the tenderness that she deserves, if you, come into a place where you can speak openly with her about sexuality, and of course, if you're obedient to the teachings of the church on chastity, on marriage, on contraception, what have you, all of that, having a reverence for the natural way that God designed our bodies in your own sexual relationship with your spouse, that's critical, because your kids, whether they ever explicitly articulate it or not, it's the school of your love that informs and kind of conditions whether or not they're going to buy into your worldview when it comes to marriage. Right? If there's a study from Oxford University, 2013, Faith and Families, that says that children who grow up in a household that is manifestly just recognized by them when they're adults as warm, that is, they grew up in a house that was warm, they would categorize their parents' relationship as warm, they are simply by virtue of that fact 27% more likely to adopt the worldview of their parents. That is, if they describe that relationship as warm. So it's your relationship with your spouse that matters perhaps more than anything else. Okay? So I cannot highlight that point enough. And I hope that speaks into your question, Martha.
Sure, definitely. They kind of catch it, maybe not by accident, but just by being immersed in that atmosphere.
That's right. It's in the air that they breathe.
Verbalized.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So what virtues would practicing natural family planning build in a marriage?
Yeah. Speaking particularly to the men and recalling, that whole, say, the McDonald's example that I gave earlier, I think that the virtue of intentionality, what you might call the virtue of ownership, is cultivated in men particularly when they participate in the process of natural family planning with their wives, right? So you don't just become sort of a passive participant, kind of like a 15-year-old working at McDonald's, in the process of reproduction, and to use kind of better, more sacred language here, in the sacred act of making love to your wife, you become not a worker in a fast food joint, right? To carry the analogy perhaps a little bit too far, you become a chef, in a family-owned restaurant. That is, you know what's going on, and the power of sexual decision making isn't only in the hands of your spouse, but rather it's something that you're intimately participating in very concretely. And I always need to do better at this myself. So far be it from me to throw stones, because I know that it can sometimes be annoying to men, even though it shouldn't be. But very concretely, I think one thing that men can do is whatever natural family planning method you're using, be a part of it. Pick some little set of things, that you can do. Whether it's helping conduct some sort of test, getting a reading, looking at an app together, whatever it might be. Create some little piece of that is your piece, even though obviously your wife could basically do everything, but participate in it in some way. Right. And there's a very concrete way that just amplifies and increases the sexual experience that you have as a couple.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Going back to what we were just talking about, how parents living a good marriage kind of creates that atmosphere that the kids kind of adopt. I just was thinking, you mentioned before we started recording that your parents were couple to couple league, a teaching couple.
They were a teaching couple. So Bo and Jeannie Bishop, Des Moines, Iowa, teaching couple with couple to couple league. And they did a marvelous job raising us. I did have a period of time in college where I fell away from the faith. I alluded to that earlier. But I had a beautiful childhood, and my parents did some things so well. One of the things that they did well, that again we highlight in the course, is there was an open channel of communication between all of us children and our parents when it came to sexuality. So I didn't just have a single standalone conversation with my dad about sex. Okay. I had a lot of conversations with my dad about sex. There was a channel of communication, not just a standalone event. And that's another of the things that we really help men do in the course. Sexual formation, it doesn't start when your kids become teenagers. It starts with their impressions of things that are in the sexual ecosystem round about 2 years old. And if you need any more evidence for that, it shouldn't be surprising to you that the LGBTQ lobby agenda is actively trying to influence young children prior to their even being able to read, with an agenda that is far different than the agenda of the couple to couple league, because they know that sexual formation starts very early. So you might be listening to this podcast and thinking, well, gosh, my son, he's only 2 years old, and so there's no reason for me to get involved with this yet. I'd say, no, it's already time. It was time a year ago, for you to jump in, and to start familiarizing yourself with, before you ever have an explicit conversation with your son about sexuality, what can you be doing when he's a toddler to prepare him to sexually flourish as a husband and a father when he's 30? Because those years are critically important. We also talk about how to have those conversations too, when your son is 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, explicitly talking about sexuality. But the course isn't only for, fathers of 13-year-old sons, right? We say it's most fundamentally for dads of sons ages 2 to 15, because all of those ages are really important.
Yeah. I think giving them the words and the language to use is
That's right.
a big part of what stops people from talking with their children about, sexuality.
Yes, indeed. That's true. Yeah, just giving there might not be a perfect, kind of lingo or way to do it. But one of the things that we do in the course is provide multiple different examples to say, hey, this is what it can look like for you to have this conversation or that conversation when your son is 3 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, what have you. So just giving some empowered language to men, to couples, to use in the sexual formation of their kids is critical.
Mm-hmm. So, what is a good time for a man to look into taking the Forge program?
I would say immediately after he gets married. So right away. But no, I mean, so I'm convicted that one of the best things that a man can do to increase the likelihood that his sons will raise families that, that flourish, in the natural human sense, also in the faith, is to get together with a group of men and to take the Forge course. Okay. And whether you are the father of 7 sons, or you're a dad who's just getting started, we've had a lot of men who are newly married, who have not yet even had their first child, let alone their first son, jump in and take the Forge course because they want to be ready. I mean, think about it. You have to realize that the fight of our times, the historical period that we're living in, the fight of our times is the fight for the family. And in so many ways, the fight for the family is the fight for men. Women just are stronger than men in this area. Usually, they're more readily committed to their families. And the fight for men is oftentimes the fight against the sexual manipulation of men. There's something so fundamental about this. And so if you think you might have a son, start early. Okay. But especially if you have a son who's 2, 3, 4, 5, I would say, especially in that 2 to 12 range, a 2-year-old through 12-year-old son, take the course, take it now. Those studies have been corroborated by many other studies over the years. The most recent of which was done by Communio. You can find out more at communio.org, an organization that just last summer in July of 2023 released a study in which they investigated 19,000 families across all Christian denominations. And that study, one of the biggest upshots of that study, was that perhaps the number one predictor of faithfulness in the next generation is the faithfulness of the fathers of this generation. So again, men are critical, not just for their kids when it comes to natural human flourishing, education, job performance, things like that, but also when it comes to their flourishing in the faith.
Right. Well, the way that I learned about you and your program was Couple to Couple League is going to be working in partnership with you in some way. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so I had the privilege of talking to a number of representatives from the Couple to Couple League who had heard about the course through one of the course's contributors, a Steubenville psychologist at Steubenville University, that is, named Dr. Matthew Bruninger. And Dr. Bruninger, who's a dear friend of mine, had been a contributor to the course and is, as I understand it, involved with the Couple to Couple League, kind of tipped the Couple to Couple League off to what we were doing on. And they just said, hey, we have a lot of dads who are involved with the Couple to Couple League who have been asking us for years to make something like this. So, yeah, I'll be thrilled. We have about 1,600 men across the country who in the last 6 months have taken the course. And that number seems to kind of be doing this, especially in the last 5-6 weeks. So there's a growing movement of men all over the country who are taking it. And I really encourage all of our listeners to get involved, or if you're a woman listening to this, to encourage your husband to get involved.
Right. Yeah. Is it ever too late to take the program?
Never too late. Yeah. Yeah. And like, I'm kind of hot on this data, but even if all of your sons are grown, it doesn't mean that you can't play a positive role, in the formation someday of your grandchildren, or alternatively, positively influencing fathers who are forming their kids now, right? And studies do show that right behind parents, it's grandparents that oftentimes play the number 2 role, the second most influential role when it comes to faith and sexuality, faith development, sexual development. of children. So lean in. Your voice is loud. It is powerful, no matter what age you are.
Right. If fathers could harness the potential that they have in their role as a father, it would society would benefit from it so greatly. It would be amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so many ways to say this, and just I think as we kind of come to a close in this podcast here, I want to make sure that this comes out loud and clear.
Right.
I take it to be a calling of mine to fight for the flourishing of husbands and fathers in our country. And there's a way of understanding the family where, when it comes to faith, when it comes to sexuality, husbands, fathers, they're so utterly critical. There's a complementary way in which the same is obviously true for women. All right. Nevertheless, as you know, John Paul II is famous for saying, I'm sure many on this podcast have quoted this before, that, as marriage goes, so goes the family. As the family goes, so goes the building blocks of the culture. You might kind of back that up a little bit to say, as sex goes, so goes marriage. As marriage goes, so goes the family. As the family goes, so goes the culture. And when we speak about the sex portion of that, to highlight this point one more time, I think that men are more easily confused when it comes to sexuality than are women. Men and women each have their strengths and weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses of men, one of the ways that we're brittle, is we give into our lust. We get confused about sexuality so easily. And even that piece on masculinity, it's so important for young men to be recognized by other men, by the whole society, as being masculine, right? I mean, the phrase, are you man enough to do something, doesn't have, whether it should or it shouldn't, it doesn't have a direct parallel. Are you woman enough to do something? So there's kind of like a brittleness almost to the male sexual psyche, and making sure that brittle, fragile, delicate aspect of the human ecosystem, that is healthy men who are at peace with their masculinity and living chaste lives, that's a hinge point, right? It's a hinge point that Satan certainly exploits to take down the family. Right. But it's also, like you said, Martha, a place that we as a church, as nonprofits who are sympathetic to the church, ought to fight for, amplify as well. Because if we get that right, the number of positive things that fall into place, it's just enormous, So it might, take a 6-module course on the cultivation of your boy's masculinity, of your boy's sexuality. That might seem kind of overkill. It's not. It's that important for all of the reasons that I just said, and it starts with you. It's the sexual formation of your children is not the school's job. It's, and even if you go to a great school, even if you have a great parish, even if you know the best priests on planet Earth, it's not their job to sexually form your son. It's yours. And it's critical that their fundamental sexual formation comes from you and not from anyone else. So are you prepared to form them in this critical aspect of their humanity, an aspect of their humanity that is currently being burned at the stake by the culture? Right. If you're looking to purchase the course, to take it yourself, www.myforge.org. You can either just access it on the homepage, or you can go to courses and content on the website. Again, that's www.myforge.org. Though I'm sure there'll be a link that goes out, to the through the couple league email newsletter as well. Don't wait, jump in. This is the kind of thing that is only done better when done earlier. So no matter where you are, no matter what the age of your children, this is the time to jump in.
All right, John, thank you so much for sharing everything that you're doing at Forge with us on the Peak Day podcast. We appreciate it so much. And I hope everything continues to go well. You have been hard at work for, I think you said your wife asked you that pivotal question 15 months ago, and here you are with
Yeah.
your program already developed and out there and ready to go.
Yeah,
It's
it's
amazing.
been an eventful 15 months, wrapping things up with focus and then jumping into the new org
Yeah,
here. But we've
yeah.
seen a lot of fruit, and it seems like things are only getting faster. So we're very
Mm-hmm.
blessed,
Mm-hmm.
and grateful to all of our donors, benefactors, and most especially the people who are getting involved, fighting with us for the family on the ground. So get
Right,
involved.
right.
Best way to get involved is to take a course. So thanks so
Mm-hmm.
much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, John, very much.